It started as a normal evening, nothing extraordinary. She had been running errands, juggling a long list of responsibilities like she always did, thinking that at least this one night she could return home, curl up on her couch, and feel a fragment of peace. The rain had begun as a soft drizzle, cool against her skin, whispering promises of calm, of a quiet night ahead. But life, she realized too late, had no interest in keeping promises. The accident was sudden, almost surreal. One moment she was crossing the street, her mind preoccupied with a work deadline. The next, a screech of tires and the sharp, violent impact hurled her into pain and panic. Sirens, voices, the world blurred into flashes of white lights and concerned faces she couldn't quite place. She couldn't move. Every bone in her body ached, but worse than the physical pain was the sharp realization that she was utterly alone. The paramedics acted quickly, efficiently. They lifted her onto the stretcher, their voices calm, professional, comforting in a way she hadn't felt from her own family in years. Her phone was in her hand, a lifeline, and her thumb hovered over her parents' contact. Maybe they would finally be there. Maybe they would care. Maybe they would finally show the warmth she had been craving since she was a child. Her call went through, the dial tone mocking her hope. Hello, her father's voice, clipped, distant. What happened? Her words tumbled out, rushed and uneven. I had an accident. I'm in the ER. Please, I need, call an Uber. He said flatly, almost as if he were reading instructions from a manual. There was no panic, no concern, no sense that his child's life had been momentarily upended. We'll send you the bill. The line went dead before she could respond. Her stomach dropped, the pit twisting, tightening, burning. The words weren't just callous, they were corrosive. The parents she had counted on all her life, the people she thought were her shelter in the storm, had treated her as an inconvenience, a transaction. Even in her vulnerability, they had reduced her to a financial matter. The sterile walls of the ER suddenly felt warmer than the coldness she had just encountered on the phone. She slumped into the gurney, hands shaking, tears threatening to fall. The nurse noticed but said nothing, simply adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, a small gesture of humanity in a world that had just shown her how little she mattered to those who should have loved her most. She stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above, feeling a mix of rage and despair. How had she not seen it before? The subtle neglect, the quiet disregard, the way their love had always felt conditional, never fully hers to claim. Her mind wandered to memories she had always held dear, birthdays when they were too busy, nights spent waiting for a call that never came, small injuries dismissed with a shrug. The pattern was undeniable now. The truth, once obscured by hope and denial, shone in its harshest light. She had been living under a fragile illusion, and it had shattered with one careless, thoughtless sentence. But amid the heartbreak, a small ember of something else flickered. It was neither hope nor forgiveness, at least not yet. It was clarity. She understood now that she couldn't rely on them, that she couldn't expect love or concern where none had ever been freely given. The world outside the ER would be indifferent, but inside, she could forge a different path, one where her worth wouldn't be measured in bills or in obligations fulfilled only when convenient. The pain in her body was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, and yet, as she lay there, alone but conscious, she felt a dangerous, thrilling possibility arise. Betrayal could be the forge for something stronger than despair. It could be the beginning of a transformation, a way to take all that neglect and turn it into power, into resilience, into a life where she would never again be disposable. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected, a spark of determination. If they thought she was weak, helpless, or dependent, they were about to be proven wrong. The cold hospital air no longer felt oppressive. It was a challenge, a canvas. And she would paint her own future, one where absence would never define her, and betrayal would become the fuel for her rise. The night was dark, the rain still tapping softly against the ER windows, and she let herself smile, just slightly, just enough. Tomorrow would be the beginning not of forgiveness, not of reconciliation, but of reclaiming everything they had denied her. The days after the ER visit felt unreal, as if the world had shifted on its axis and she had been left behind, dangling somewhere between shock and disbelief. Every phone buzz, every notification made her flinch, half expecting a message from her parents, an apology, concern, even a single question about her well-being. But there was nothing, only silence punctuated by their earlier words, looping endlessly in her mind. "Call an Uber. We'll send you the bill." She tried to reach out again, carefully, almost timidly, hoping that maybe her parents had been busy, that maybe the coldness she had heard was just a bad moment. She called, she texted, she left voicemails filled with restrained panic. Each attempt was met with the same sterile, calculated distance, vague assurances, clipped instructions, an absence so profound it felt almost intentional. Her friends thankfully were there, but even their concern couldn't fully bridge the chasm her parents' betrayal had created. They offered hugs, lunches, small distractions, words like "it's not fair," and "you don't deserve that." But those words, though sincere, were not the balm she craved. Her parents' rejection cut deeper than any casual oversight, any minor slight. This was foundational. This was the people who were supposed to protect her, the ones who had promised love unconditionally, dismissing her as though her pain were inconvenient and irrelevant. She replayed the moment in the ER again and again, dissecting it like a surgeon examining a wound. The tone in their voices, the lack of urgency, the clinical way they spoke of money while she was lying on a stretcher. It wasn't an accident. It was habitual, a pattern she had ignored for years. She had forgiven too easily in the past, excusing neglect as busyness or stress. But now, with clarity sharpened by pain, she saw it for what it was. Emotional bankruptcy. Her life, her suffering, her needs irrelevant, secondary, a ledger entry rather than a human being worthy of care. Anger rose slowly, a simmering fire in her chest, not the violent, uncontrollable kind that screams and lashes out, but a quiet, calculated fury. The kind that doesn't just burn. It reshapes. She realized that revenge wouldn't come in the form of confrontation. She didn't want to humiliate them, didn't want to inflict pain for the sake of satisfaction. No, she wanted to rise above them. She wanted to take the love they refused to give and cultivate it elsewhere. She wanted to create a life so full, so radiant, that their absence would be undeniable, not physically, but emotionally. For the first time in years, she considered what her life could be without them, free from their judgment, their indifference, their cold calculations. The thought was intoxicating. She began small, investing more in her career, reaching out to friends she had neglected, exploring passions she had put aside. Every book she read, every skill she honed, every late night phone call with a friend who truly cared felt like a stitch in the fabric of a new life, one they had no claim over. And yet, even in her quiet rebuilding, there was grief. She mourned the years she had wasted, the moments she had hoped for love that never came. Birthday parties, family dinners, nights when she had lain awake wondering if anyone would notice her absence. Those memories pressed against her ribs like invisible weights. She allowed herself to cry sometimes, letting the tears run freely in the privacy of her apartment, away from judgment or dismissal. It was a necessary cleansing, a way to honor the pain while refusing to let it define her. Gradually, the ember of revenge began to take shape, not as malice, but as a plan. She would show them not with confrontation, but with evidence, that the child they had disregarded could thrive, could love fully, could build a life they could never imagine. She would become the embodiment of self, worth, and resilience, the living proof that emotional neglect could never destroy her. The betrayal had left a wound, yes, but also a roadmap. The path wasn't easy. It required courage, discipline, and the kind of patience that could outlast years of indifference. But she was ready. The people who had treated her like a ledger entry had no idea that their actions were planting the seeds of her transformation. Every pang of bitterness, every echo of their neglect would fuel her rise. As she sat alone in her apartment that night, the city lights glowing faintly through rain-streaked windows, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't the child abandoned in the ER. She was something more, and they, unknowingly, had handed her the tools to prove it. Betrayal had hurt, yes, but it had also awakened her. The months that followed were grueling, not in the way of pain, but in the relentless discipline she imposed on herself. Each morning began with intention: wake up early, push past the remnants of self-doubt, and chip away at the inertia that had kept her tethered to a life defined by absence. She threw herself into work with a precision that left no room for distraction. Every report completed, every project finished, was more than accomplishment. It was proof to herself that she could succeed without anyone's approval. She began to notice subtle shifts in her own psyche. The vulnerability that had once been a weight became a tool. Instead of expecting care from those who never offered it, she learned to give it to herself. She learned to soothe her own fears, to nurture her own ambitions, to acknowledge her own worth. Every step forward was a quiet rebellion against the years of emotional neglect she had endured. Her social circle transformed as well. She sought out people who brought light into her life, those who valued her presence not because of obligation, but because of genuine connection. Friendships that had been tentative blossomed into unshakable bonds. She celebrated others' victories with sincerity, and in turn, they celebrated hers. In those relationships, she discovered the warmth she had been denied at home. The love she received from chosen family, the kind that required effort, empathy, and respect, was a stark contrast to the conditional care she had long mistaken for parental love. She invested in her body and mind, not for vanity, but for empowerment. Long runs at dawn, hours spent in the library, evenings learning new skills. They became rituals of self-respect. Every ache from exertion reminded her that she was alive, that she had control over her own existence. She laughed more, truly laughed, with people who appreciated her wit and intelligence. This smile that had once been timid and unsure became radiant, a beacon of the life she was deliberately constructing. Financial independence followed naturally. She learned to manage her money meticulously, transforming her bank account into a fortress of security. Every investment, every calculated risk was another nail in the coffin of dependence. She was no longer the child left in the ER, waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She was a force, deliberate and unstoppable, building a life no one could undermine. In quiet moments, she allowed herself to think about her parents, but differently now. No longer as figures who could hurt or control her, but as benchmarks for what she refused to become. The sting of their neglect was still present, a ghost that occasionally whispered doubt or sorrow, but it no longer dominated her. She channeled that pain into ambition, into generosity toward those who needed it, into creating a life filled with dignity and meaning. The most subtle, sweetest part of her revenge came naturally. Without fanfare, she began documenting her successes, small achievements, charitable efforts, milestones in her career. She shared glimpses with her social circle, carefully curated, never to boast, always to inspire, but she knew they would notice. The posts, the photos, the mentions of accomplishments, they were breadcrumbs, subtle markers that she was thriving without their presence. Each like, each congratulatory message from friends and colleagues, was a quiet affirmation that she had surpassed the limits they had silently imposed on her. Yet her transformation was more than just external. She felt a profound inner shift, an emotional recalibration. Fear of abandonment faded into resilience. Doubt of her worth transformed into confidence. The child who had called the ER, trembling and unheard, was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned to thrive despite betrayal, to love despite neglect, and to rise with grace and determination. By the time a year had passed since that night, she was unrecognizable to the version of herself who had dialed her parents with hope. She had created a life brimming with meaning, filled with people who chose her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. And somewhere deep in her heart, a quiet, satisfying thought began to take shape. They will see, they will know what they lost. Revenge, she realized, didn't need to be dramatic. It didn't need to be a confrontation or a harsh word. True revenge was living fully, joyfully, authentically. It was the accumulation of achievements, of love, of happiness that they had refused to nurture. It was the quiet knowledge that she had taken their absence, their coldness, and transformed it into the most potent weapon imaginable, a life they could never touch, a happiness they could never claim, and a success they could only witness from a distance. The transformation was complete. The fire they had sparked in her, through neglect, through betrayal, was no longer destructive. It was radiant, controlled, and unassailable. She was free. She was unstoppable. And soon, she would ensure that they would understand, in the quietest and sweetest way possible, the true cost of their indifference. Years passed, and with each one, she became more herself, stronger, wiser, untouchable. The girl who had called her parents from the ER, trembling, scared, and ignored, existed only in memory. In her place stood a woman who had forged her own path, nurtured her own happiness, and surrounded herself with people who cherished her unconditionally. Every achievement, every laugh, every moment of contentment was a quiet triumph over the indifference that had once defined her life. It was at a charity gala of all places that she saw them again. Her parents, polished and composed, standing in the crowd with the same superficial smiles she remembered from her childhood. They had aged, but their presence carried the same undercurrent of detachment, a subtle reminder of the emotional distance they had always maintained. For a moment her heart skipped not out of fear, but in recognition of the power she now held. She walked toward them, calm and deliberate, each step measured, each breath steady. They greeted her politely, their smiles tight, practiced. "It's good to see you," her father said, a little too carefully, as if testing whether her warmth could be manipulated. "We heard about your work." Her mother's voice trailed, hesitant, almost searching for a way to insert concern, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She smiled, a real smile, one that carried warmth but also the quiet weight of history. "Yes," she said. "It's been a journey." She didn't pause, didn't let their awkwardness unsettle her. She had rehearsed nothing. She needed no script. Every word, every movement, was guided by the confidence she had built over years of neglect, of struggle, of self-reclamation. Then, with gentle precision, she told them about the foundation she had started, a project that had grown beyond her imagination. It helped young adults who, like her, had been abandoned or ignored by the very people who were supposed to love them. She spoke about the children she had mentored, the lives she had touched, the gratitude she had earned. She spoke not to boast, but to narrate a truth they had failed to witness. That love could not be measured in bills, that care could not be bought, that absence did not define her worth. Her parents listened, their expressions flickering between pride and discomfort, the awareness of their own failures pressing into the space between them. They said nothing, at least nothing meaningful. Words could not undo the years of absence, could not erase the nights she had spent hoping for concern that never came. But in their silence she heard everything she needed to know. She let the moment linger, allowing the weight of her life's accomplishments to settle in the room like a quiet accusation. She didn't need to argue, to yell, to demand acknowledgement. She didn't need their validation. They had given her the coldness of indifference, and she had responded with warmth, purpose, and success. That was the revenge. That was the justice. For a fleeting second, she imagined the look of recognition dawning on their faces, the realization that the child they had discarded, the one they had reduced to a mere ledger entry, had not only survived but flourished, that the absence they had inflicted was no longer a weapon against her, but a tool she had used to construct an entire life they could never enter. She excused herself shortly after, leaving them to reflect in their uneasy silence. As she stepped out into the crisp night air, the city lights shimmering across the pavement, she felt a profound satisfaction. Not satisfaction born of cruelty, but of triumph. She had transformed betrayal into strength, neglect into purpose, absence into fulfillment. Her phone buzzed, a message from one of the young adults at her foundation, thanking her for guidance, for believing in them, for being the parent she had never had. She smiled softly, her chest swelling with warmth. This was her legacy, her real family, the people who mattered, the lives she could touch. The past, with all its pain, was nothing more than a stepping stone to this life. In that moment, she understood the sweetest revenge is not measured in confrontation, not in anger or humiliation, but in the quiet, unshakable power of a life well lived. She had taken the hurt they had given her, and transformed it into joy, into love, into resilience. They had sent her a bill from the ER. She had sent herself a life that they could never touch. And in that quiet, glowing triumph, she finally felt free. The girl they abandoned no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had turned betrayal into beauty, rejection into wisdom, and neglect into the most enduring, satisfying revenge of all. A life she could never take from herself,